It's been more than long enough to let the season content settle, as well as letting some additional patches hit. So let's finally get into the new content, and then some extra changes after that. Not everyone may agree with me, but in my opinion the biggest game changer we got this season was the introduction of the Hazard 5+ modifiers. These are technically a way to get more rewards, but the main actual point of them is just turning up the difficulty for its own sake. These are similar to some of the effects you can get in modded difficulties, except you get them while still running a vanilla lobby, so I can play with a much larger population of players. Starting with the most popular, more bugs. To explain some of this modifier's effects, we need to quickly cover the enemy spawn pools. The spawn pools determine what kinds of enemies spawn, not how many of them do. Any mission has a number of enemy slots in the main spawn pool determined by hazard level. The number of slots ranges from 5 at Hazard 1 to 8 at Hazard 5. Some of these slots are reserved for specific enemies. 2 of the slots are always reserved for common enemies, which are Grunts and Praetorians. These enemies have a chance to promote into what the game internally calls veteran enemies. These are slashers or guards in the case of Grunts, and oppressors in the case of Praetorians. Veteran enemies do not take up slots in the spawn pool. The game simply rolls the chance to promote the base common enemies as they spawn. Then, some of those slots are reserved for disruptive enemies. These are Wardens, Menaces, Stingtails, Goo Bombers, Shellbacks, Grabbers, Bulks, and the new Stalkers. There are 3 slots reserved for disruptive enemies on Haz 5. So, since we have 8 slots in the main spawn pool, 2 of which are reserved for common enemies and 3 of which are reserved for disruptive enemies, that's 5 slots occupied, which leaves another 3 slots free for what are commonly referred to as special enemies. These are Swarmers, Exploders, Web Spitters, Acid Spitters, Septic Spreaders, Macterospawn, and Trijaws. Like Grunts, Macterospawn can promote into 2 different veteran types, Trijaws and Brundles. And in that case, these veterans do not fill separate slots in the spawn pool. However, you can also roll to specifically get just Trijaws in a special enemy slot. The same is not true for Brundles, they must promote from a Macterospawn. Biome-specific enemies that aren't just replacements go in these slots as well. So, Trawlers, Shockers, and Small Rollers are effectively also special enemies in their biomes. Now, back to more bugs. Like all Haz 5+ modifiers, it has 2 levels. Level 1 has a 1.2x multiplier for both spawned bugs and the spawn cap. Also, it increases both the main and disruptive spawn pools by 1. This doesn't mean 2 more types of enemies can be in the spawn pool per mission. Remember that the main spawn pool is further divided into the other categories. So if you increase both the main spawn pool and the disruptive spawn pool by 1, that new slot in the main spawn pool just gets taken up by the +1 disruptive enemy slot. So the end result is that at level 1 more bugs, it allows 4 types of disruptive enemies to spawn instead of 3 per mission. But due to spawn RNG, you won't always see all 4 in a mission. Level 2 of more bugs has a 1.5x multiplier for both spawned bugs and the spawn cap, and it increases both the normal spawn pool by 3 and the disruptive spawn pool by 2. This time, the main spawn pool is getting increased by a higher number than the disruptive spawn pool is. That means that the disruptives don't take up all of the increased space on the spawn pool, and the end result is that on level 2 more bugs, per mission you can have 5 types of disruptive enemies spawning instead of 3, and 4 types of special enemies spawning instead of 3. Again, you won't always see all that variety depending on spawn RNG. Finally, it also adds a 1.15x multiplier to the odds of bugs promoting to veterans. To put it simply, more bugs is a very good modifier, and it's popular for good reasons. It doesn't just make the game harder, it's also just fun. And increased enemy variety per mission helps keep you on your toes. Next, aggressive enemies. This modifier makes a few things faster: enemy move speed, projectile speed, and attack cooldown. On level 1, the multipliers are 1.23x move speed, 1.1x projectile speed, 1.33x attack cooldown speed. On level 2, the multipliers are 1.32x move speed, 1.12x projectile speed, 2x attack cooldown speed. All of these are pretty tangible and require more attentive play across the board. It's worth noting, though, that 2x attack cooldown speed does not mean enemies attack twice as fast. An enemy's attack has 2 parts: the attack animation itself, and then the cooldown. For instance, grunts have their stab move and their bite move. Both these attack animations take 0.73 seconds to perform. Then, after that, you have an attack cooldown of 1.5 seconds, which can tick faster or slower depending on hazard level. Hazard 3 has a 1.0 multiplier for its speed, and Hazard 5 has a 1.5 multiplier, meaning the cooldown takes 66% of the time, or 1 second, to tick down on Haz 5. The 2x attack cooldown speed cuts this in half. The result of this is that Haz 5 grunt attacks take 1.73 seconds, and with aggressive enemies too, that's reduced to 1.23 seconds, which is nearly a 30% decrease in the time it takes a grunt to attack, which is significant, but not twice as fast. In general, the most significant part of this modifier is the move speed. You need to react to incoming enemies much faster, and it's much harder to kite. Projectile speed is second most impactful, as it can make ranged enemies a fair bit harder to dodge. And lastly, enemy attack speed is felt, but not as much as you may initially think. Again, this is another good modifier that demands more careful play and better reactions. Starting with player vulnerability, we get into the more divisive stuff. At level 1, player vulnerability adds multipliers for damage taken. 1.5x enemy damage, 1.43x friendly fire, and 1.25x environmental damage. At level 2, these increase to 2x enemy damage, 2.14x friendly fire, and 1.5x environmental damage. If those friendly fire modifiers seem strange, bear in mind that the base friendly fire mult on Haz 5 is 0.7. Multiplying that by 1.43 increases it to 1x, and multiplying it by 2.14 increases it to 1.5. The environmental damage increase does not apply to fall damage, which is untouched. Speaking for myself, this modifier is a sometimes food at best. More damage is not necessarily a bad way to increase difficulty, but increasing the amount of enemies and the rate they move/attack are both, in my opinion, more interesting ways to threaten players more. I'm very unlikely to turn off those modifiers, and with those already on, turning on player vulnerability can easily become excessively punishing. And lastly, tough bugs. At level 1, this modifier gives large enemies an extra 1.5x damage resistance. At level 2, that raises to 1.75x, and also small enemies get 1.33x damage resistance. If I am being 100% fair here, does this modifier change things? Yeah, it does. But is it fun to play with? Not so much, especially at level 2. To put it very simply, I do not want the health of all bugs to increase, changing breakpoints all over the place, and slowing down the overall pace of the game. Level 1 is not awful, but when I turn just that on, I still quickly find myself reconsidering once a Praetorian wave spawns. So, all said, the rule set I've normally been playing on these days is more bugs 2, aggressive enemies 2, and sometimes player vulnerability 1. A setup like that is a nice, enjoyable degree of challenge, while 2 all is neat once or twice for the novelty, but past that point becomes a bit annoying. As for rewards, your hazard bonus is increased by 3% per level of more bugs or aggressive bugs, and 5% per level of vulnerability or tough bugs. These increases are not really equal to the level of increased danger the modifiers bring, but again, that's fine since the real reason people play with these is the challenge itself. Haz 5 plus aside, we've got some new enemies as well. The Stalker is a disruptive enemy with a unique cloaking effect that tries to sneak up on its target. It makes sounds while approaching that both lets you know you should be watching for one, and what direction it'll be coming from. You can then notice the blue shimmer as it approaches. You can force it to burrow by damaging it, or reveal it by pinging it, but be aware that if you reveal it this way, it'll get a buff that doubles its move speed. So unless you just don't have good single target, consider just shooting it instead. If it gets up close, it'll uncloak and melee you with an 18 base damage attack, applying 2 different status effects on hit and then burrowing. The first status effect is a 50% slow that only lasts 1.5 seconds. The second is the shield break effect. It completely disables your shields, and this effect actually takes place before the melee damage calculation happens, which means on Haz 5 with 4 players you'll take the full 61.2 damage as if you had no shields at all. This status lasts for 20 seconds, though your shield's regen time does pass during this, so once the status wears off, you'll immediately start regenerating your shields unless you just got hit by something else. Stalkers have 360 base health and normal scaling, going up to 432 on Has 5. Their legs and the plate on its abdomen take 80% damage, and the whole face is a typical 2x weak point. Not just the glowing forehead, their mandibles also count. Accurate weapons can drill them down pretty fast.
I got the Stalker! Did you see that?
They do have a slight 25% electric resist and a noticeable 50% melee vulnerability, so serrated edge pickaxe power attacks do good damage, but ideally you're killing it before it gets that close. And then there's the Core Spawn Crawler, our new faction enemy, so to speak. These currently only spawn as part of the seasonal event. They're sort of tanky, with 280 base HP, 336 on Has 5, and a difficult to hit weak spot. They also hit relatively hard at 9 base damage for 30.6 on 4-player Has 5. That's a little over double what a grunt hits for. The most notable thing about these, however, is their fast and erratic movement. They already typically move at 450 move speed. That's slightly above the player's sprint speed of 435. That's the speed they use when moving towards a player to melee them. Their speed can spike up to as high as 810 when repositioning. Plus, they will leap about erratically. The two saving graces of their weird movement are, 1. After meleeing a player, they will disengage for a moment and reposition instead of just immediately smacking you again. And 2. Their leap is not an attack, it's strictly movement. Crawler's weak point is not only small, it's covered by 2 bits of heavy armor. These plates sometimes briefly open and only have 35 base HP, 42 on Has 5, but despite the patch notes, they don't work like normal heavy armor, and weapons with armor break mods cannot hit the weak point on the same shot that breaks the armor. Unless they're being unusually still, it's not super worth trying your hardest to hit the weak point, and you probably just want to crowd control these things to death. Also, on death they drop these puddles that deal damage over time if you touch them. It's 3 base damage, so 10.2 on 4-player Has 5 every 0.5 seconds, and they stick around for 12 seconds. Even if they die from being burned, disintegrated, or frozen, they still drop the puddles. But since the crawlers only spawn during the Corestone event, there's not much point in talking strategy outside of that, and as it turns out, there's a pretty simple winning strategy. The Corestone event is pretty straightforward. Once broken out of the pillar, it creates rifts on nearby terrain that spawn the crawlers, and it has a life bar with 3 segments. These scale dramatically with both hazard and player count, the whole life bar having 2,700 HP total on 1-player Has 5, and 7,200 HP on 4-player Has 5. Notably, the bottom glowing bit of the Corestone is a weak point with 1.15x multiplier, and it does enable weak point bonuses on weapons. When each segment is depleted, it becomes momentarily invulnerable and reforms the pillar around itself. But, of course, you all already know how to deal with this. This is an event that normally is pretty dangerous. In a vacuum, crawlers are nasty enemies, and fighting them honestly isn't easy. But they're melee enemies, and they're the only enemies the event spawns, which means if you sit on a zipline away from the ground, you are completely and totally safe from danger. You just shoot the rock, ignoring the crawlers, and when it remakes the pillar, Driller just blows it up with C4. If you don't have a Driller, you drop down and Gunner shields the stone to pickaxe the pillar, then you get right back up on the zipline again. It was also previously possible to completely skip the whole event by using Gunner's shield to block the Corestone from spawning rifts in the first place, triggering a failsafe, but that has since been patched. If you want to do this event without cheese, you'll want a lot of crowd control. Cryo Driller and Bullet Hell Gunner are both good for locking down the crawlers, but the gap in difficulty between cheesing and not cheesing this event is always large. With Has 5 plus modifiers turned on, it becomes especially difficult, which is part of why the cheese is so popular. Plus, the event never times out, so if things go south, you cannot wait out the event. It's win or wipe. The aesthetic and music are quite good, but there's a few things I wish were different here. First, the event should have a timer so it's possible to fail it but not wipe. Second, I think the crawlers should be nerfed a bit further to make fighting them without cheese less demanding. And third, I think they should either have a ranged variant or some kind of ranged attack so ziplines aren't a free win. Ideally, zip cheese both wouldn't be a guaranteed clear, and fighting them honestly wouldn't be such a difficulty hike compared to other events. Stalkers and crawlers weren't the only new enemies, but before covering the new stationaries, I should mention a change to damage types. Previously, there were a number of enemy attacks that were misleading in the type of damage they dealt. For instance, while Praetorian's Acid Spit does poison type damage that gets resisted by Engi's armor and elemental insulation, before Season 5, Acid Spitter's damage was generic and not resisted by anything. Meanwhile, Shellback's projectiles that are bright green, just like Praetorian Spit, again did not do poison damage, they did explosive damage. Same goes for Spitballer's projectiles. And Dreadnought's fireballs didn't do fire damage, and Nadosite Chalker's attack that applies an electric slow didn't do electric damage. In Season 5, that's all been tweaked. Acid Spitter's projectile still does kinetic damage, but now the DOT afterwards is poison, so Engi's armor mod and elemental insulation resist it. Shellback and Spitballer projectiles are now 50% explosive and 50% poison damage. So Engi, Gunner, and Elemental Insulation all provide partial resistance to this. Dreadnought Fireballs do 50% explosive and 50% fire damage, so Gunner, Driller, and Insulation all partially resist them. And Nadosites now do electric damage instead of melee damage, so Insulation resists against them. Now, I can take some credit for this change because I basically bothered Mike about it until he put it through, but that unfortunately also means I'm indirectly responsible for Thorns no longer working against Shockers because they don't do melee damage anymore. Anyways, that's all relevant to the new enemies because the new stationary enemies do partial poison damage, just like Spitballers do now. There's two new stationaries, Barrage Infectors and Vartok Scale Brambles. Barrage Infectors are like extra big and significantly tankier Spitballers. They have 1200 base HP, which is 50% more than Spitballers, and aren't weak to fire. They attack by spitting out 9 relatively slow globs that stick to surfaces and then explode, dealing up to 85 damage on 4-player has 5. That's half poison, half explosive, in a 3.5 meter radius. These shots are much slower and easier to avoid than a Spitball shot, but they function as area denial and make it harder to push into a room. If you've got space, you can do a wide strafe around them while killing them, but that's not always possible, so don't be shy in using shields to push these. Vartok Scale Brambles are the second new stationary. They spawn along with several nodes connected by roots running along the ground, which are crucial to find because the Scale Bramble itself is completely invulnerable until you break them. They're squishy at least, both the main body and nodes only having 120 HP on has 5. As long as they're active, they'll keep bombarding you with bursts of 3 shots that deal at base 3 poison and 5 kinetic damage. That means 10.2 poison and 17 kinetic damage per shot on 4-player has 5. Enough to break shields in one shot and deal over half your HP if you eat the whole burst. Because the nodes are often hidden around cover, you'll frequently want to either push in with a shield or let the scout fly off and snipe them to enable everyone to move in. And of course, the mission type added this season was Deep Scan. There's not much I can say here that everyone doesn't already know, but I should at least give a little advice on finding the crystals since I sometimes still see players have issues with this. You can put effort into triangulating them based on the sensor, but at the end of the day, the fastest way to find them is generally just to run through each part of the cave. Just look on the map for anywhere unexplored and go through those tunnels, and you'll wind up finding the crystals without doing anything fancy. As usual, time's a-wasting and your nitra isn't infinite, so getting a move on is in your best interests. As for the Drill Evader segment, it goes without saying that area denial effects like Sticky Flames and Volatile Impact Reactor are strong here. And you want to take advantage of that, because if bugs actually get onto the cramped elevator platform, things get nasty fast. New mutators too. Ebonite Outbreak adds Ebonite Glyphids, which work just like the event, only dying from melee damage. Molly drops pickaxe power canisters to deal with them, and if you keep on top of them, it's not a problem. But if things get out of hand, having gun-immune enemies mixed into a swarm can be very bad, so don't slack on clearing them. Duck and cover means ranged enemy spawns are vastly increased. That means tons of acid spitters, Mactera, septics, and so on. You tend to have smaller enemy waves with this, but it's still really dangerous. Certainly one of the most dangerous mutators in the game, if not the most. Having good damage at long range is very important for this. You do not want to be an Engi with a Warthog or Driller with a short-range cryo build if you can help it. Then we have Blood Sugar, a mutator where you take damage over time, but enemies drop red sugar on death. This effect is pretty trivial on higher hazards, but more dangerous on lower hazards due to lack of sugar. but it does cause swarmer waves to mitigate this, which is why you're seeing swarmers show up during this Dreadnought fight, so this doesn't really cause issues based on hazard level or mission type. And double secondaries, a mutator that has probably spiked the Brighter Objects mod's downloads even higher than it previously was. Lastly, a couple miscellaneous changes. Engun's changed to have more cave variety, and dashing won't get overridden by other speed boosts anymore. There's a new phase for the Heartstone fight, and it cycles randomly between its phases, so you don't know which two attack phases you'll get between the swarm phases now. The new attack type is a Crystal Trap. The Heartstone will target a player, and after a delay, it will grow a crystal cage around them. This will miss if you keep moving, and it doesn't hurt dwarves, but it will do huge damage to Doretta if it grows underneath her, so don't stand on top of her. If you're comfortable with the fight, it's fine to get on top if you know it's targeting someone else, or no one at the moment, but less experienced players should probably just stay off of Doretta altogether during this phase. Also, I had some people inquiring about how cluster charges interact with Nitro Compound. If it needs to be said, under normal circumstances, Nitro Compound is a really weak upgrade, and I suppose the hope here is that cluster charges would make it good. Bad news though. So the first thing is, it is technically true that Nitro interacts with cluster charges, but it's in a very ineffective way. The way it works is that each bomblet, aside from not having thrust or guidance and having different base damage, basically functions like a separate missile. They inherit traits from the parent missile, which is why both the Tier 4 explosive damage mod and the Overclock's ×2 explosive damage effect boost their damage. So when you equip Nitroglycerin Compound, the bomblets, once released, are their own missiles and start gaining +1 explosive damage, which, like the main missiles, doesn't get multiplied by the OC's damage boost, it's still +1, every 0.75 seconds they are in the air. Nitro's effect is already not worth it, but in this case, the bomblets are almost never in the air long enough to get any damage boost at all, even if you're trying to milk the effect. The second thing is that Nitro's damage boost sucks so bad that even if they inherited the timer from the parent missile on top of getting multiplied by having more explosions, it still wouldn't be a very good increase. The stun chance from that competing mod is getting multiplied in an appreciable way. You're getting way more chances to stun things from all the bomblet explosions, which makes that mod even better than it already would be. So even if Nitro functioned in a more useful way, the opportunity cost of skipping the stun mod just doesn't make sense. I think that's about everything. Shouldn't be any more weirdly long gaps in my upload schedule now. See you again soon.